In the summer of 1887, the docks of Portsmouth buzzed with the usual noise: hammers clanging, sailors shouting, steam whistles blowing. Ships came and went, proud and polished, their brass gleaming under the English sun. But among them sat one vessel that drew more smirks than salutes. She wasn't tall, she wasn't sleek, and she certainly didn't look like she belonged among the Royal Navy's mighty ironclads. Her name was HMS Resolute, and to most people she looked like a mistake. She was short, barely longer than 2 fishing boats tied end to end, and squat, with a hull that seemed too thick for her size. Her single smokestack leaned slightly as if even it wasn't sure it wanted to be there. Her guns were hidden behind armored shutters, not proudly displayed like on the grand cruisers. To seasoned officers, she looked less like a warship and more like something cobbled together in a shipyard on a slow Tuesday. The truth was, Resolute had been built on a whim. A retired naval captain, brilliant but stubborn, had spent years arguing that the future of sea warfare wasn't about size, but speed, armor placement, and smarter guns. He believed a small, nimble ship with the right kind of protection and firepower could outmaneuver and outfight much larger opponents. The Admiralty, tired of his letters and lectures, finally gave him a tiny budget just to make him stop talking. They never expected the result to actually sail, let alone fight. When she was launched, the ceremony was small. No dignitaries, no brass band, just a few dock workers and a handful of curious children. One old sailor muttered, "That thing wouldn't last 10 minutes in a squall, let alone a battle." Another joked that she'd be better off as a floating pub. The nickname Thorne's Teapot stuck almost instantly, named after her designer, though he wasn't even there to hear it. The crew assigned to her were mostly young, fresh out of training, eager but untested. Some had requested transfers the moment they saw her. "I signed up to serve on a real ship," one grumbled, kicking a loose bolt on the deck. But others saw something different. They noticed how solid she felt underfoot, how her engines purred like a well-tuned clock, how her gun crews could reload in half the time of older models. Still, their pride was quiet. They knew what people said when they walked into town in their uniforms. "Oh, you're on the Resolute? Bless you." For months, she did nothing more exciting than patrol the coastline, chasing smugglers and checking buoys. While other ships sailed to distant colonies or joined Grand Fleet exercises, Resolute stayed close to shore, bobbing in the gray English waves like a forgotten afterthought. Her logs were filled with routine entries: weather fair, no incidents, coal levels normal. It was the kind of duty that made time feel heavy. But the crew began to bond in that quiet rhythm. They patched leaks together, shared stories in the cramped mess, and learned every creak and groan of the ship like it was part of their own bones. The captain, a quiet man in his late 30s, passed over for bigger commands, spent evenings studying charts and testing new firing drills. He never raised his voice, but his calm certainty slowly earned their trust. He didn't call her a teapot, he called her steady. Back in London, the Admiralty barely remembered she existed. When budget meetings came around, someone would glance at her file and say, "Oh, that little experiment. Still floating, I suppose." They kept her on the books more out of embarrassment than belief. After all, scrapping her would mean admitting they'd wasted money. Better to let her rust quietly at the edge of the fleet. Meanwhile, across the ocean, tensions were rising. A rival power, wealthy, ambitious, and armed with a modern navy, had begun flexing its muscles in the South Atlantic. They claimed a chain of small islands that Britain had held for decades, islands rich in seabird droppings. Strange as it sounds, guano was worth its weight in gold for fertilizer. At first, it seemed like a minor dispute. But when British merchants were turned away at gunpoint and a Royal Navy survey ship was fired upon, the mood in Whitehall shifted fast. The Admiralty scrambled. They sent a proper squadron. 3 armored cruisers, proud and powerful, led by a seasoned commodore. These were the ships everyone respected, the kind that appeared on postcards and in schoolbooks. As they steamed south, newspapers hailed them as the Iron Fist of the Empire. No one even thought to mention Resolute. Why would they? She wasn't built for open ocean. She wasn't meant for war. She was, in the eyes of the Navy, just there. But out in Portsmouth, the crew of Resolute watched the fleet depart with a strange mix of envy and unease. They cleaned their guns a little more carefully that week. They double-checked the seals on their ammunition lockers. They didn't talk about it much, but each man felt it, the quiet hum of something changing. The world was moving toward conflict, and for the first time, they wondered if their odd little ship might have a role to play after all. No one laughed when the news came 2 weeks later. The proud squadron had been ambushed near the islands. Outnumbered and outgunned, 2 cruisers sank within hours. The third barely escaped, limping back with blackened decks and a shattered mast. Dozens of sailors were lost. The enemy Armada, 5 ironclads, fast and heavily armed, now controlled the waters. Panic rippled through the Admiralty. Reinforcements were weeks away. The islands were about to fall, and in that moment of desperation, someone in a smoky office flipping through dusty files at 3 a.m. paused. His finger landed on a single sheet of paper. HMS Resolute. Coastal defense vessel. Portsmouth. Ready for sea. He didn't know much about her, just that she was small, fast, and still floating. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Orders were drafted, a telegram sent, and in the gray dawn of a rainy morning, the crew of Resolute stood on deck, stunned into silence as the message was read aloud. They were to sail south immediately. Their mission, hold the line. For the first time, the little ship that no one believed in was being asked to do the impossible. And as the engines fired to life and the anchor lifted from the seabed, even the doubters among the crew felt something shift. Not just in the ship, but in themselves. Maybe they weren't just patrolling anymore. Maybe they were finally going to prove what they and she were truly made of. The news from the South Atlantic hit Britain like a cold wave. One morning, people were reading about cricket scores and royal garden parties. The next front-page headline screamed about sunken ships and a foreign fleet blockading British islands. Panic didn't spread fast. It wasn't that kind of panic, but a quiet, heavy worry settled over ports, naval towns, and government offices alike. The enemy wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. They were taking territory, and they'd done it with brutal efficiency. In London, the Admiralty scrambled. Maps were spread across long tables, fingers tracing sea routes, calculating how long it would take the main fleet to reach the conflict zone. The answer was always the same. Too long. Weeks. By then, the islands would be lost, the garrison surrendered, and the enemy would have dug in deep. Worse, if they held those islands, they'd control a key shipping lane. And that meant trouble for trade, for supplies, for the whole empire's rhythm. Back in Portsmouth, the mood aboard Resolute had changed completely. Gone was the routine boredom of coastal patrols. Now every man moved with purpose. The ship, once ignored, was suddenly the center of urgent activity. Extra coal was loaded. Fresh water barrels were lashed down. Ammunition, round after round of the new high-velocity shells, was carried below with careful hands. No one joked anymore. Even the youngest sailor, who'd once rolled his eyes at the ship's odd shape, now ran his fingers along the gun barrels like they were sacred. The captain didn't give a big speech. He didn't need to. He simply walked the decks, checking every knot, every hatch, every fuse. His calm was like an anchor in the rising storm. When a nervous gunner asked if they really stood a chance against 5 ironclads, he just looked out at the harbor and said, "We don't have to beat them all. We just have to make them think twice." That was enough. Preparations were rushed but thorough. The crew worked through the night, their oil lamps casting long shadows on the wet decks. Some wrote letters home, short ones full of "don't worry" and "all is well," even though none of them knew what lay ahead. Others sharpened tools, mended sails. Yes, she still carried a small set for emergencies, or practiced loading drills in the dim light of the gun deck. Every second counted. What no one outside the ship knew was how different Resolute really was. Her armor wasn't just thick, it was layered, a mix of steel and a new kind of hardened wood that absorbed shock better than solid iron. Her guns, though fewer in number, could fire 3 times faster than standard naval artillery, and their shells were designed to pierce deck plating, the weakest spot on most big warships. She couldn't win a head-on brawl in open water, but in the narrow channels and shallow bays near the islands, she might just vanish like a ghost and strike like lightning. 2 days after the orders came, Resolute slipped out of harbor before dawn. No fanfare, no crowds, just a quiet departure under a sky streaked with pink and gray. As she passed the last buoy, the crew stood at attention, not for show, but because they felt it. This wasn't patrol duty anymore. This was real. The journey south was rough. The Atlantic didn't care about missions or empires. Waves slammed into her bow, spray icing the rails. For days, the ship groaned and shuddered, testing every bolt and seam. Some sailors got sick. Others barely slept, listening to the creak of timber and the hiss of steam, wondering if their little ship would hold. But she did. She cut through swells that would have slowed bigger vessels, her low profile keeping her steady. She wasn't built for comfort, but she was built to endure. Halfway to the islands, they spotted a lifeboat, drifting, half sunk, with 3 survivors clinging to the remains. They were from one of the cruisers lost in the ambush, sunburned, dehydrated, eyes hollow with shock. One could barely speak. Another kept repeating, "They came out of the fog so fast. We never saw them coming." The crew of Resolute gave them water, dry clothes, and a place to rest below deck. But their stories painted a grim picture. The enemy Armada wasn't just powerful, it was smart. They used the weather, the island's layout, even the sun's position to blind their targets before striking. That night, the captain gathered his officers in the chart room. Candles flickered. Rain tapped on the roof. "They think we're coming the same way the cruisers did," he said, pointing to a wide channel on the map. "But we won't." His finger moved to a narrow, winding passage between jagged rocks, a route marked unsafe for vessels over 150 feet. Resolute was 1 to 42. "We go in quiet. We stay hidden, and when they least expect it, we hit hard." The plan was risky. One wrong turn and they'd be stuck, or worse, dashed against the rocks. But it was the only way. The enemy would be watching the open sea, waiting for reinforcements. They wouldn't waste a lookout on a channel they thought no warship could navigate. As Resolute neared the island chain, the crew grew quieter. Not from fear, but from focus. They blacked out every light, wrapped chains in cloth to muffle noise. Even the cook stopped clanging pots. The ship became a shadow, slipping through the dark like a whisper. Then on the 3rd evening they saw it. Smoke on the horizon. Not 1 plume, but 5, thick, black, proud. The enemy Armada, anchored in a wide bay, confident and calm. Their ships loomed like floating fortresses, cannons glinting in the sunset. Music drifted across the water. Someone was playing a fiddle on deck. They weren't expecting a fight. They thought the war was already won. Able seamen exchanged glances. Some tightened their grips on the rail. Others took slow breaths, steadying themselves. No one spoke. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. This was their chance. Not just to defend an island, but to prove that size isn't everything. That heart matters. That the quiet ones, the overlooked, the underestimated, can change everything. Resolute turned gently into the fog rolling in from the sea. The engines slowed to a murmur. The guns were loaded, aimed, ready. And as the mist wrapped around her like a cloak, the little ship that no one took seriously prepared to do the one thing no one believed she could: face an Armada. And fight back. The fog rolled in thick and slow, like a blanket pulled over the sea. Inside it, Resolute moved like a shadow. No lights, no steam whistle, engines turned so low they barely whispered. Every man on deck held his breath, not because of the cold, but because of what lay ahead. Through the mist, the shapes of enemy ships loomed like sleeping giants. 5 ironclads anchored in a loose circle, their decks quiet, their crews relaxed. They had won. They knew it. And that made them careless. The captain stood at the bow, eyes fixed ahead, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't pace, didn't fidget. He just watched, listened, felt the rhythm of the ship beneath his boots. He'd spent nights studying tide charts, wind patterns, even the way fog clung to these particular islands. Now all that quiet work was about to be tested. Below deck, the gun crews waited in near darkness. Their hands rested on cold metal, fingers tracing the edges of shells they'd loaded hours ago. One young sailor, a boy really, barely 19, rubbed a small wooden carving in his pocket, something his grandfather had given him before he left home. He didn't pray, not exactly, but he whispered a promise to himself. Just do your job. Don't freeze. Don't fail them. The plan was simple but terrifying. They'd slip between 2 of the anchored ships, close enough to hear voices if the wind shifted. Then at the captain's signal, they'd open fire, not at the thick sides, but at the decks. The new shells were designed to punch through thin plating and explode inside, where powder stores and steam lines lived. One good hit could cripple a ship faster than a dozen broadsides to the hull, but timing was everything. Too early and they'd be spotted. Too late and they'd drift into open water, exposed and alone. The crew had practiced this maneuver in the English Channel over and over, until their muscles remembered what their minds couldn't hold. Now in real darkness with real danger ahead, they trusted that training like a lifeline. A faint creak, a distant laugh from an enemy deck. The smell of coal smoke mixed with salt air. Resolute glided forward, her hull barely making a ripple. She was so low in the water that from the ironclad's height, she might as well have been a piece of driftwood. One of the enemy lookouts yawned, leaned on the rail and looked right over her, seeing nothing but fog and sea. Then a sound. Not from the enemy, but from their own ship. A loose chain clinked against the hull. Every heart stopped. The captain didn't flinch. He just raised one hand slightly, a signal to hold. Seconds stretched like minutes. No alarm bells, no shouts. The enemy hadn't heard, or didn't care. They were in position. A single soft whistle cut through the air, barely louder than the wind. That was the signal. Instantly, shutters snapped open along Resolute's deck. Gun crews sprang into motion, not with wild energy, but with calm, practiced speed. The first shot fired before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The shell arced through the fog and struck the deck of the nearest ironclad with a sharp crack, not a boom. Then came the explosion, muffled at first, then roaring as fire bloomed inside the ship's belly. Chaos erupted. Sailors on the ironclad stumbled from below, coughing, shouting. Steam pipes burst, lights flickered and died. Before they could even aim their massive guns, Resolute had already turned slightly and fired again, this time at the second ship. Another hit. Another explosion. Now the enemy knew they were under attack, but they couldn't see who was attacking them. They fired blindly into the fog, their heavy shells whistling overhead or slamming into the water far from Resolute. Their big guns were meant for long-range duels, not close-quarters ambushes in near-zero visibility. They were powerful, yes, but slow, clumsy, like trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. On Resolute, the crew worked like a single heartbeat. Load, aim, fire, reload, no shouting. No panic, just steady, relentless rhythm. The ship rocked with each shot but never lost her balance. Her small size, once mocked, now made her nimble, dodging between the giants, vanishing into the mist after every strike. One ironclad tried to steam forward, its propeller churning the water. But the channel was too narrow. It scraped against a hidden reef, listing hard to port. Another turned its guns downward, finally realizing the threat was below. But by then, Resolute was already behind it, hammering its rudder with precise shots. The ship spun helplessly, colliding with its own ally. Torpedo boats, small, fast, deadly, launched from the rear of the Armada, skimming the waves like angry wasps. But Resolute's secondary guns, quick-firing and deadly accurate, stitched lines of fire across the water. One torpedo boat exploded in a spray of wood and flame. Another veered off, its crew abandoning ship. Back on the main deck, the young sailor with the wooden carving finally let out the breath he'd been holding. His hands were shaking, but he kept loading. Beside him, an older gunner, a man who'd once called Resolute a floating joke, grinned through the smoke and said, "Well, I'll be damned. She's got teeth after all." The captain never left the bow. He called out small course corrections. "Starboard 5, steady as she goes." His voice calm even as splinters flew past his head. He wasn't a hero in the storybook sense. He didn't roar or wave a sword. He just did his job with quiet certainty, and that was enough to hold the whole ship together. After what felt like hours but was barely 40 minutes, the firing slowed. The fog began to lift, burned away by the morning sun and the fires still burning on 2 crippled ironclads. The rest of the enemy fleet was in full retreat, their proud formation shattered, their confidence broken. They hadn't just lost a battle, they'd been humiliated by a ship they'd never even considered a threat. Silence returned to the bay, broken only by the crackle of flames and the groans of wounded metal. On a Resolute, no one cheered, not yet. They were too tired, too stunned. They checked on their wounded patched leaks and stared at the wreckage around them with wide eyes. Had they really done that? One by one, the crew looked at their ship, not with pity or embarrassment anymore, but with something like awe. She was dented. Her paint was scorched. Water sloshed in the lower hold. But she was still floating. still fighting, still theirs. And for the first time they understood. It wasn't about how big you were. It was about how you used what you had, how you stood when no one believed you could, how you showed up when the world needed you, even if you were small, even if you were strange, even if everyone called you a teapot. As the sun rose fully over the islands, casting golden light on the smoke-streaked water, the crew of Resolute began the slow work of securing the bay. They didn't know it yet, but their quiet victory would echo far beyond these shores. But for now, in that moment, they were just sailors on a battered ship, proud not because they'd won, but because they'd tried, and proved that sometimes the smallest spark can light the biggest fire. The morning after the battle was quiet, not peaceful but heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. Smoke still curled from the burning hulks of 2 enemy ironclads, their masts leaning like broken bones against the pale sky. The sea, usually restless, seemed to hold its breath. On Resolute, no one spoke much. Men moved slowly, tending to the wounded, checking the ship's hull for damage, or just standing at the rails staring at what they'd done. It didn't feel real. Hours ago, they were the Navy's forgotten crew on a ship everyone mocked. Now they'd stopped an entire armada, 5 ironclads, torpedo boats, hundreds of enemy sailors, with nothing but fog, timing, and a handful of well-placed shots. One older sailor sat on a crate, hands shaking as he tried to light a pipe. He'd served 20 years and never fired a shot in anger. Now he'd helped sink a warship. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The captain walked the deck not as a conqueror but as a caretaker. He checked on the injured, made sure fresh water was passed around, and gave quiet orders to secure the bay. There was no grand celebration, just the steady work of survival. They still didn't know if enemy reinforcements were coming. They still had a garrison on the main island to protect, and Resolute herself had taken hits. A shell had grazed her stern, tearing a hole just above the waterline. It wasn't fatal, but it meant constant pumping and careful sailing. What surprised them most was the silence from the enemy. No radio messages, they didn't have them yet. No signal flags, not even a rescue attempt. The surviving ships had vanished over the horizon before dawn, leaving their dead and wounded behind. It was as if the Armada had been a dream, and Resolute had woken them up with a punch to the gut. By midday, a small boat rowed out from the island. It carried the garrison's commander, a grizzled officer who'd been preparing to surrender just yesterday. He climbed aboard Resolute with wide eyes, taking in the scorched decks, the quiet crew, the distant wrecks. He didn't say much at first, just nodded, then gripped the captain's hand so hard his knuckles turned white. "We saw the flashes in the dark," he finally said. "We thought it was thunder. Then we heard the explosions, and knew someone was fighting for us." His voice cracked. "Thank you," word began to spread. Fishermen in nearby coves who'd hidden during the invasion cautiously returned. They brought fresh fruit, bread, even a goat someone had been saving for a feast. They didn't know the ship's name, but they knew what she'd done. To them, she wasn't odd or small, she was a miracle. Back in Britain, the news traveled slowly at first. A coded signal from the island garrison reached a relay station in Cape Town. From there, it crackled over telegraph wires to London. At first, the Admiralty didn't believe it. A single coastal vessel defeated 5 ironclads? One officer scoffed. Someone's misread the report. But as more details came in, confirmed by rescued sailors, by the garrison, even by neutral merchant ships who'd seen the smoke, the truth settled in like a stone. Newspapers, once full of doom and defeat, now scrambled to rewrite their headlines. "David of the Sea," one proclaimed. "The tiny terror that saved the empire." Reporters who'd never heard of Resolute now called her the ghost ship and the Iron Mouse, Britain's secret weapon. The same men who'd laughed at her design now praised her revolutionary genius. It was strange, almost funny, but the crew didn't care about the praise. They were too busy patching leaks and writing letters home. Yet something had changed in them. The young sailor who once hid his ship's name when visiting town now stood taller. The gunner who doubted every drill now taught new recruits with quiet pride. Even the ship herself seemed different, not because she'd changed, but because they finally saw her clearly. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't glamorous, but she was tough, smart, and loyal, just like them. In London, the Admiralty held an emergency meeting. Blueprints of Resolute were pulled from dusty files, Engineers studied her armor layout, her gun mechanisms, her hull shape. Within days, orders went out. Build more like her. Not exact copies. She was too specialized for that, but ships that used her ideas. Low profile, fast-firing guns, smart armor placement. Naval schools added her battle to their textbooks. What had been an experiment was now doctrine, but none of that reached the crew right away. They were still far from home, still on duty. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, the captain gathered everyone on deck, not for orders, but just to be together. No speeches. No medals yet. Just men who'd faced the impossible and walked through it. Someone started humming a tune. Then another joined in. Soon the whole crew was singing an old sea shanty. Voices rough but warm. It wasn't about victory. It was about being alive. About trust. About the quiet bond that forms when you rely on each other in the dark. A week later, a proper British squadron finally arrived. Big, polished ships with gleaming brass and full bands. They expected to find ruins. Instead, they found Resolute anchored calmly, her crew helping rebuild the island's signal tower. The officers from the new ships came aboard, respectful now, almost shy. They asked questions. How did you get so close? How did your shells pierce their decks? The crew answered plainly, without bragging. They knew luck had played a part. So had fog. So had the enemy's arrogance. But mostly it was preparation meeting opportunity. As Resolute prepared to sail home, the islanders gathered on the shore. They didn't wave flags or cheer loudly. They just stood there silent and grateful. One old fisherman pressed a small carved figure into the hands of the youngest sailor, a seabird, wings spread. For luck, he said. The boy tucked it into his pocket, next to the wooden carving from his grandfather. The journey back was calmer. No storms, no enemies, just open sea and time to think. Some men slept for hours. Others wrote long letters trying to explain what couldn't be put into words. The captain stood watch often, not because he had to, but because he liked the quiet. He'd look at his ship, the dents, the patched hull, the soot on the funnel, and feel something close to love. She'd done what she was built to do. And so had they. When they finally reached Portsmouth, the harbor was packed. Not with officials or reporters, but with families, friends, dock workers, even children perched on shoulders. Banners hung from cranes. A band played, not the national anthem, but a simple, familiar tune. As Resolute glided in, battered but proud, the crowd didn't roar. They clapped, steady, respectful, like they understood what it had cost. No one called her Thorn's Teapot anymore, and as the crew stepped onto the dock, tired, thinner, older in the eyes, they knew something the world was just beginning to learn. Sometimes, the quiet ones change everything. Not with noise, not with size, but with heart, with grit, and with the courage to show up when it matters most. Life after the battle wasn't loud or flashy, it was quiet, steady, and full of small moments that meant more than any medal. When Resolute finally docked in Portsmouth, the cheering crowd soon went home. The newspaper headlines faded, and the ship slipped back into the rhythm of harbor life. But everything had changed. Not just for the Navy, but for the men who'd sailed her through fog and fire. At first, the attention was overwhelming. Reporters wanted interviews. Schoolchildren wrote letters asking how it felt to beat 5 giants. Admirals who'd once ignored the ship now walked her decks with measuring tapes and notebooks, asking questions like they'd just discovered fire. But the crew didn't enjoy the spotlight. They'd done their duty not for fame, but because it needed doing. So they answered politely, then went back to scrubbing decks, checking engines, and mending sails, just like before, only now with a little more pride in their step. The captain was offered a promotion, command of a brand new cruiser, bigger and faster with a crew twice the size. It was the kind of offer most officers dreamed of. But he turned it down. "My place is here," he said simply, and no one argued. They understood. Resolute wasn't just a ship to him. She was the proof that good ideas, even small ones, deserve a chance. Meanwhile, shipyards across the country began building new vessels inspired by her design. Not copies, she was too specialized for that, but ships that borrowed her best tricks, lower profiles, smarter armor, guns that fired faster and hit harder. Naval colleges started teaching her battle as a case study in how surprise, terrain, and timing could beat raw power. Old school officers grumbled at first, but even they had to admit, The world of sea warfare had shifted, and it had shifted because of a ship no one believed in. Back aboard Resolute, life settled into a new kind of normal. She was no longer sent on boring patrols. Instead, she became a training ship for new gunners and engineers, those who wanted to learn how to fight smart, not just big. Young recruits would board with wide eyes, having heard the stories, and leave with calloused hands and a deeper understanding of what courage really looked like. Not shouting or swagger, but showing up, staying calm, and doing your part when everything around you is falling apart. The crew stayed mostly the same. Some left, called to other ships, or retiring after years at sea, but most stayed. They'd been through something together that couldn't be undone. They knew each other's habits, fears, and quiet jokes. They didn't need grand speeches to feel like a family. A shared cup of tea on a cold watch, a hand offered to steady someone on a wet deck. That was enough. One evening, months after their return, the youngest sailor, the one who'd carried 2 small carvings in his pocket, was asked by a new recruit what it was really like during the battle. He didn't talk about explosions or heroics. He said it was scary, really scary, but you don't think about that when you're in it. You just do the next thing, and the next, and you trust the man beside you to do his part too. He paused, then added, "That's how we won. Not because we were special, because we didn't quit. That spirit spread, not just through the Navy, but through towns and villages." Parents told their children the story of the little ship that saved the day. Not to glorify war, but to teach a lesson. Never judge something by its size. Never write off the quiet ones. Sometimes the most powerful things come in small packages. Years passed. Resolute grew older. Her paint faded. Her engines needed more care. But she never stopped sailing. She took part in exercises, helped test new equipment, and even escorted merchant convoys during tense times. She wasn't flashy, but she was reliable, and that mattered more. When the time finally came for her to be retired, there was no grand ceremony. Just a quiet day in dry dock. The crew, older now, some with gray in their hair, gathered one last time. They walked her deck slowly, touching the places where shells had struck, where ropes had frayed, where they'd stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark. No one cried, but eyes were wet. Instead of being scrapped, as many old ships were, Resolute was preserved. Not as a monument to war, but as a lesson in humility and hope. She was moved to a naval museum, where children could climb aboard carefully, run their hands over her guns, and read the simple plaque mounted near her bridge. She was small, but she was mighty. Not because of her size, but because of those who believed in her. Visitors often asked the old sailors who served as guides, "Was it really just you against 5 warships?" And they'd smile and say, "It wasn't just us. It was her too. She held together when she didn't have to. She gave us a chance and we took it." Long after the last crewman passed away, Resolute remained. School groups came. Veterans stood quietly at her rail. Artists painted her in morning light. And every time a storm rolled in off the sea, the museum staff would check her lines just out of habit, because somehow she still felt alive. Her story never became a legend of destruction or conquest. It became something quieter and far more valuable, a reminder that being underestimated isn't a weakness, it's an advantage. That preparation beats pride. That heart matters more than horsepower, and that sometimes the world changes not with a roar but with a whisper, and a single well-aimed shot from a ship no one took seriously. Even today, if you stand on her deck and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The hiss of steam, the creak of timber, the calm voice giving orders in the fog. Not the sound of a warship, but the sound of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they refused to believe they couldn't. And that, more than any battle, is why she's remembered.